All right, let's rock.
Yeah.
You know who I am. I'm going to be moderating the presentation today. Obviously, we are recording the event. We're going to post it on. Hi, Debbie. We're just about to kick off. I'm Oliver Mill. I'm going to be facilitating today. I'm an advocate from Galway in Ireland. We're recording this event. It will be posted on the site in the YouTube channel in a few days. INSA, for those who don't know, is a volunteer organization aimed at connecting pro-sortition academics, advocates, and activists around the world to share resources and tactics and to advance the theoretical understanding of sortition. We established a Discord server, and to which an invitation is posted in the chat, and you're very welcome to join. And you can also join our email contact list via our website. Everyone's already got the mics off, which is great. The topic today is sortition in professional businesses, what we can learn from their practices, by Dr. Aaron Gain, who's going to highlight case study examples from research of organizations that are using sortition, what has worked and what hasn't. Dr. Gain is a researcher, educator, and manager, focusing on using mixed research methods to understand organizational and people development, employee and stakeholder engagement, and workplace democracy. Exploring alternative non-managerial forms of organizing is central to his work. He's also a volunteer mentor for young social entrepreneurs. He has a background in health and care as well as consultancy, having worked for the National Health Service, the Australian Department of Health and Human Services, Deloitte, and various charities. If you have any questions during the talk, please use the raise hand button or put your question in the chat, and Dr. Gain will address those as we go. All right. Yeah. Please welcome Dr. Aaron Gain.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you very much. So, hi, everybody. I assume I've shared the slides with everyone, so I just assume that you can all see them. Just give me a shout, obviously, if there's anything going wrong. But they are a guide. So, to be honest, I won't be taking you through lots of detailed slides. They're a guide for a discussion. So, just a quick introduction about what I'm going to talk about today. Initially, is I'm going to be giving you some findings from particular case studies. I'm not going to go into lots of the theoretical sort of background and associated sort of references, etc. It's more of a sort of a discussion of some of the findings. I'm more than happy to do that if that's what you'd like to do at a later date. But I wanted to engage everybody in some of the topics and issues and discussion points. So just to reiterate what Oliver said, I'm happy to take questions as we go along. That's not a problem. That's fine. But there are, obviously, I'm not going to talk for the whole period. I'll stop and try and, open up. I'm sure you have some experiences which are either similar or different, and that's great. It'd be nice to get into that conversation. So won't be talking about the theory, particularly the references, but we'll be talking about the case study experiences. So these are findings which are case study findings, so they are useful, but they are not always and simply generalizable. We can't just say this is how it is. So it's a part of my learning is to talk to people like yourself as well to understand where my findings may be different to your experiences, and that's absolutely fine. But case studies are what they are. They have their limitations, as you all know. So I'm quite happy to answer any questions as we go along. I will naturally stop and open it up a bit as well. So that's absolutely great. And I will try and, it's not a list of the sort of do's and don'ts of doing sortition in professional businesses, although there are some help, there's some tips, I think, about how you might do it. It is more a straight description of the findings and the key discussion points, because I think you can find some really good do's and don'ts about sortition in businesses. I know, Ben has presented. I'm not going to replicate what Ben has done before, and obviously, other speakers, and I'm sure other references and sources you can find. But it is about how sortition might be useful in certain types of organisations that I've experienced. Okay, so unless there's any other questions, I'll sort of go on to the next slide. Is that okay? Yep, I'll take that's fine. Brilliant. Thank you very much. First of all, I just wanted to clarify what might be described as sort of unique selling point of what I'm going to talk about. Just things that might be slightly different from other types of sortition analysis in organisations. So I'm talking about professional organisations, and I'm talking about health and care, so people with clinical or social care background and professions, and also the organisations that I'm talking about are employee owned. So I know employee owned is different to obviously issues of sortition and workplace democracy, but there are some really strong connections between the two areas. So I just want to make sure that, people are aware of the case studies that we'll talk about. They are employee owned, and I'll talk a little bit of that later on. But also they are being asked to do this sort, the project groups, the sortition project groups are being asked to do some really important strategic decisions. They're not doing very minor issues. They really are tackling some really important issues, and they didn't answer them completely, but that is fine. These are ongoing issues that these organizations will tackle. So I think it's an interesting case, a couple of case studies I looked at, in the sense that they didn't come from a idea of setting up sortitions from a theoretical basis. They came up with them because they thought that they would help the organization develop. So they didn't really read a lot of theory, and that's fine. Once again, it was a very sort of bottom-up type approach, and I think there's something in that. Is where sortition comes from. It's a really important question. Okay, so just take you through the case studies, because I think it is difficult to understand the sort of issues here if we don't understand the case studies. So 2 employee-owned entities. I've named them Red City and Blue County, so we can use those as descriptions for them. They delivered community-based care, so this is social care, some health care, children's-based care in the UK. So these were services which had mixed funders. Sometimes the NHS funded them, our health service. Sometimes local authorities and social care funders. Sometimes they had private, individuals would fund them. So they had a whole mixture of funding streams, broadly speaking. And also that these are not small organisations. This is the point trying to make, that sometimes people feel that workplace democracy works better in small organisations, and these weren't small organisations. They are medium to large organisations, and are dealing with quite complex service delivery. So this is not very small and not very straightforward service delivery, complex and large. And approximately 70% were staff owners. This is when, obviously staff have some legal equity of the organisation in some form. So about 70%. So a good majority did. And they have all the governance systems of workplace democracies or cooperative systems, where there's some type of written constitution, there's annual general meetings, there's staff representatives, as I'm sure all of you are aware of those representative systems, and there will be departmental decision making. And my study was a qualitative study, so I didn't do surveys. It was very ethnographical. So I went and visited these organisations and interviewed them and watched what was going on. That's the best way to describe it. And the field work approximately between 2019 and 2022. So these were the bodies that I was looking at. So I just wanted to take, before we sort of open up a little bit, just take you through the basics. What happened, just to try to explain, what these, what the empirical things that were happening, which were of interest to me. I did not start off wanting to study sortition. I just went to study these organisations, and I found that they were doing it. So it was quite interesting in the sense that I didn't go looking for it, but I thought, oh, this is interesting, because I hadn't seen it before. So there was a real issue of the problem of representation, which, once again, I think you all are aware of the issues around the problem of representation. But representation was quite wide in these organisations and was seen to be quite a good thing. So I wasn't beginning from an idea that this was inherently bad, because compared to many organisations, some staff representatives on boards are actually a very good thing, and are something that you can build on rather than impose. So, but there was quite a lot of low engagement and a lack of authenticity in participation. So the organisation that was owned by its staff was still struggling to get people engaged. So there was a real value placed on face-to-face participation, and I've quoted Liz, the social worker, there. Face-to-face participation is better than someone else representing you. So there was something intrinsically intuitive about sortition to the staff. here. This wasn't theorized thinking. This was something that they knew intuitively that could be done better. So the two organizations set up two groups completely independently. They don't know each other, these two employee-owned organizations. Red City looked at the options for increasing employee participation. So they did look specifically at the sort of workplace democracy issues. But interesting, Blue County looked at setting up a group that would look at how they would grow as an organization. So it wasn't specifically about workplace democracy in that way. So there was clear policy outputs. They were asked to advise the organisation on what to do, but there's some ambiguity there, isn't it? It's not very precise. You could start to get into these questions in a bit more detail. So there was some flexibility there, which I think is helpful for all of them. So just a little bit about the facts and figures about they called them owner, citizen, juries. That was the other thing to mark there. So they was thinking of owners as being citizens of the organisation. The Blue County citizen jury was initiated by the annual general meeting, and the annual general meeting is the assembly of all the staff owners. So they initiated, we need to set up this group because we need them to look at this issue. Okay. And then the staff representative council asked to set up the Sortition group in Red City. So it's slightly different, but these weren't managerial, hierarchical, imposed groups. They were, to some extent, from the bottom upwards. And as I said earlier on, not theorized in the way that we would understand them. The language of sortition wasn't used. That term wasn't used. Workplace democracy really wasn't used. It was more citizen juries. That was the language that they could feel comfortable with, which I think is interesting in itself. So just a little bit of background about Blue County. Both employee-owned entities are similar enough for me to make similar findings. There are some slight differences there, and I'm more than happy to do more detail. But broadly speaking, they're fairly similar size, and the sortition processes that they went through were quite similar. So I'm not distinguishing between the two of them. So Blue County had 15 people in a group, and Red City had 14. And then you see a breakdown of those people within those groups. So they chosen by, your bylaw or sampling, random sampling, but they did make sure that there was a representative sort of split between the professions. It wasn't completely randomly sampled. Now, I'll go into that some later on, but that I think is justifiable given the professional nature of the organizations that we're dealing with, that if you had an over-representative of a certain group, that would not give you that wider perspective of the owners of the organization. So broadly speaking, that was a good representation of the two organizations. And as Ben interestingly talked about when he last spoke to you, he talked about the processes and the steps of sortition or citizen juries in organizations. These organizations follow that same sort of pattern, starting off with a sort of exploring what the issues are, trying to identify the problem. What are we here for? What are we doing? What information are we collecting? To going through a process of collecting data, discussing, changing their mind, going back to their departments and speaking to people and coming back again, going through that sort of process of deliberation. And then what we also did was that we did an additional reflective session at the end where I joined them and facilitated a sort of a non-decision making process, just a reflective. How did you experience being in this project group? So that's a bit of research that I was sort of engaged in, that pure bit of reflection. And you'll see a little bit later on in the slides some of the ways that we try to do that. So the last thing before I've opened up to any more questions, about this case studies, just iterate, consider to be sort of incremental, practical, instrumental. This wasn't a sort of big radical change. This was something that everybody felt was in line with their perceptions of being an employee-owned organization. It was seen to plug the gaps of representation. So whether, and something you may want to think about is how radical your rhetoric needs to be if you want to introduce sortition. In some organizations, the more radical it is and the language you use, the less likelihood it's going to get implemented. So sometimes you have to just walk away from some of the theoretical language here. And that's what this organization did. They didn't really use that very much. And approximately 6 to 9 months, and as I explained earlier on, there's lots of project stages. Yeah, lots of different project stages they went through. And that was fairly standard. They did follow a sort of a standard methodology for how they do that. And it was internally facilitated. So I was a non-participative observer. So didn't even get involved in facilitation until the very end, when it was really just a reflective learning session rather than actually a sort of pure sortition session. So internally facilitated, and there are some weaknesses and strengths of that. So just wanted to stop there really, and just open it up. Has anybody got any reflections about the case studies or questions of clarity they want to ask me before we get into the findings?
Rich.
Oh, sorry, Rich. Yeah. Hi.
Hey, no, I just noticed that one of the two case studies actually had a patient involved.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I think that's pretty interesting approach. The other one didn't. Was there any information around that you can add?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. There's quite a long track record of NHS organisations and local authorities and voluntary groups, charities, getting patients engaged in these sort of processes. And if it was a service-related project, they're more likely to have a patient involved. So if it's outward-looking, it's about how we develop services, they're likely to have a patient representative. If it's more internal, it's likely that they wouldn't do, and that's probably the rationale, I think. Yeah. Okay. So it's happy people just happy for me to go on. Is that okay? Yeah, I don't want to drag on. So what I'm going to do is just take you through some of the outcomes. Yeah, and then what I'll do is I'll give you some of the ways in which we gather data, and that will lead us to some discussion points. Hopefully, I'm trying to sort of naturally take you through the steps without going too quickly or too slowly, but talk about some of the pure outcomes of the project, some of the findings, and then open it up for some sort of findings, pointers for the future. So just some really practical sort of deliverable terms. What did these groups actually do at the end of all these processes and meetings? Is that Red City reported on ways at which the organisation can increase employee-owned participation. So, they listed all those classic ways in which they could get people engaged. Okay, really interesting ways of getting people to be developed and trained, so people felt comfortable, trying to support those staff members in organizations which lack power, to put it really bluntly. In these organizations, the less professionalized your occupation, the less confident you are engaging in participation. Yeah, there's a power imbalance going on here. We tend to talk about managers and sortation, being a way of sort of rebalancing an organization, so it's less hierarchical. But within professional organizations, you've also got this occupational hierarchy going on here. So if you want, your less professional staff to be engaged, you've got to think really clearly about how you engage with them. And Red City did a very good job on some of that. And I can obviously share detail if people are interested. And Blue County that looked at how to grow the organization came up with not just sort of practical things about, we need to do this service or we need to go into this geographical area. They actually created, and I thought this was really interesting, was they created some guidelines or criteria for assessing opportunities. So rather than being a ordinary organization with a profit motive, the staff group wanted to see, well, we don't just grow into an area because we can make a bigger profit. We got to make a profit, a surplus. It has to be economically viable, but there are other things that we are interested in as well. So we do not enter some markets, some geographical positions, some services, if we don't think we can provide the service according to the organization that we are in. And it helped managers critique those opportunities, so they didn't go into areas in which there would be a really disjointed relationship between the new opportunity and the existing organization. And I thought that was quite an interesting way to look at it. So there was some sort of practical things that they come out with. There were also significant implementation problems in staff-intensive sectors. So I don't want to dwell on all the implementation problems because there's so many, and they're not the only thing. But there are some real practical problems around the use of IT. The use of IT. How do you get information to people? How do you train and develop people while they're in the sortition groups? Do you train them before they go into the sortition groups? Do you just train them while they're in there? So there are some real problems. But when you have staff-intensive industries where 80% of your cost structure is staffing, you cannot run these groups unless you have a proper backfill. I don't know if that's the right expression in other countries, but in the UK, if you take a member of staff out of a unit, a department, to work in another department or to work on this project, you've got to backfill them. You've got to give that department the staffing cost to be able to release them to join this project group. And if you don't resolve those problems, no one's going to volunteer for these things. It's really difficult to departments to encourage their staff to be engaged in sortition if that backfill process is not there, particularly when you have staff intensive groups. And you have a lot of conflict here. But what I'm really trying to say to you is that the conflict is not always bad, and is actually quite inherently important for this process to be successful. And I'll talk about some of that bit later on. And the last outcome that's sort of formal is this issue about it was ongoing. So these weren't the only groups that they had. They were successful enough to encourage the organization to keep doing it. So they were doing at least one of these a year, perhaps more, but at least one of sortition processes is happening every year. And I think that's important in terms of learning as well. So findings. I've split the findings into two big groups, really. One's process, not outcomes, and the other ones is understanding conflict. So I'll just take you through some of the findings that we found. First of all, we all know the value of process in sortition, don't we? The process itself is just as important as the outcomes. People come out of these processes different from what they were when they went in, because they learned something about organizational decision making. They learned something about their organization they didn't know before, and that process of liberation has molded the person that they are. So it was valued by staff. It altered their perspectives. It altered their confidence. People came out of the process more confident than they were at the beginning. Okay, has to be said. Secondly, they all accepted that these things were really hard. And I thought that was really interesting. They recognized and acknowledged the difficulty of making these complex decisions. Yeah. And that the control that managers would normally have on these sorts of decisions was only going to be, wouldn't be just given up and given to these sortitions groups unless they showed real commitment. Okay. So it's not a control by managers, not easily given up. It has to be earned. Okay, not just given by the fact that you just turn up to a project group. There's something, levels of emotional commitment here, and this is where I think there's some implementation problems. But these are bigger implementation problems. There are significant obstacles. You've got to give people time to do it. The compressing of available time is a real problem here. If they don't have time outside the actual meetings, they're not going to get anything done. Yeah, there are fears that some people actually took on too much responsibility. Maybe people, they're self-exploited. So you've got to be careful of engaging people enough, giving them enough time, but also being wary that they're not taking on too much. Okay. And then we come on to sort of just understanding conflict a little bit more.
If I can jump in there, there's just one question from Chris Ellis in the chat.
Oh, sorry.
Was there issue with union versus non-union participation, i.e. a union member doing work outside of the scope of their role?
Yeah, no, good point. Trade unions were fairly supportive of the involvement, and were heavily involved. So there was a union rep on each of these groups, and they were, most of the trade union representatives that were in the organisation are professionals as well. So there's lots of professional trade unions or associations. So when I do talk about professional groups, you're absolutely right. I am actually talking about some of the trade union groups as well. So nurses and doctors are involved in professional organisations that are also trade unions at the same time. They overlap. So my issue about conflict is really understanding this conflict, as conflict is not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that these things are going wrong. They're actually exposing and making more transparent things which really do need to be made. So it's how you manage the conflict coming out of that. Think of the conflict as more creative spaces. It enables people to come up with some things which are much more interesting. It's how that facilitator manages the conflict within the group, between the professional groups and also outside. It's having a clear strategy for how you're going to manage the conflict, and also don't underestimate how difficult, once again, these issues of making these decisions and understanding the information that you're gaining when these people are not managers. So they have little or no experience of doing this sort of organizational wide type work. I'm not saying that they're not capable, but they don't tend to have a track record of being comfortable with these things. So it's something like it's a long-term thing that we're actually talking about here. And just remember that also managers are challenged, but also will resist as well. So this conflict around you're taking things out which has historically been managers' decisions, and we're taking those decisions away from managers, and we're opening it up to a wider group. And there is some resistance, some counter proposals coming from managers about trying to just limit the sortition group. So you've got to be able to manage some of that difference. So that's where the ambiguity comes in a bit later on. So just a couple of things that I thought really important is this concept, and I know many of you have seen it before, this idea of you learn to participate by participating. This isn't learning by textbook. This is intuitive. This is tacit learning that's going on here. So Catherine, this is a few quotes here. Others thought it would be a high level talk and they would just look silly, but if only they would get involved. It's not like that at all. So there's something about just being in it. Overall, I'm really different. This process has helped me. I'm a different person than I was before. And I'm much more confident, but I would say you can only understand it by being in it. And, I'm a qualitative researcher. When I look at that last statement, I think that's a fascinating one. You can't understand what's going on unless you do it. And I think there's something really important about just grabbing that in your mind about the complexity, the experience that these people are going to have by doing something which is fundamentally quite different and new to them. So I'm just going to leave it to do a couple of more slides and then I'll stop. I just wanted to show people how we collected some of the data. So when at the end of the sortition, one of the groups, I said at the end we did the reflective work. We got people to just talk about how they experienced that sortition process, and I used the various forms of graphic. So I had an arrow here of opposite arrows where on the left hand side you'll see social. Are we here about changing the way in which we work? We have social aims, but we're also about changing the way we work. We want to work in a different sort of organization that's less hierarchical, or are we on the right hand side a pure business which just has some sort of social mission? So we're a bit more of a social enterprise. Where are we on here? And what was interesting that there was, I asked people to draw arrows about where we were going, and what you can see there is contradictions. That's people writing arrows in slightly different directions. And interestingly, someone's written there, it's a constant battle. So this idea of sortition as being a way of debating this sort of hybrid nature of these organizations. When you introduce employee ownership, when you introduce workplace democracy, you're changing the organization's vision of itself. It's no longer the organization that you thought it was before it introduced more workplace democracy or even high levels of participation. And there's a constant tension and battle between those two areas. And then also you can see comment number 4, B there on the right hand side has written back and forth. So this idea that there's constant renegotiation in sortition, and sortition is a way of not having the answer to everything, but just find a mechanism for resolving some of these things. It's it's not the end point, it's a mechanism for dealing with this hybridity that you've got. And hybridity is really quite complex in these businesses. They are organizations that want to have high levels of participation. They are owned by their organizations. They don't want tall hierarchies. They don't want managers and the board making decisions. At the same time, they have to be financially viable. At the same time, they have to produce and deliver quality care services. And these different logics don't always fit together. And I think the participants in these case studies looked at sortition as a way of dealing with these issues and trying to find the hybrid between those different sort of conflicts going on. And they are never resolved. They are always ongoing. Because the customers' service users change, the government changes, you get new staff, you develop your services. So it's a constant sort of renegotiation going on there. So these are just some of the quotes of some of the people, nurses and other social workers and therapists, and this is how they saw it. Malik particularly, it's not one-way traffic. Well, we also highlighting that we all wear many hats. So this idea that people in these organizations and in this sortition processes, they were multiple hybrid people themselves. They were nurses, they were a staff owner, they were a professional group, and they were managing other nurses. So they were by definition, they had multiple identities. So they were trying to understand these different sort of logics for running the organizations as a way of their own identities and how they tackle these issues themselves. So the last thing I wanted to leave really, and I can, we don't have to go into detail, I want to open up to questions, is that I also asked, once I got through these sort of discussions, I try to ask the participants in the sortition, can you just visualize your experience? And I try to get them to think about their own model rather than force them to do my model, which are the arrows. I said, well, if you could explain what was going on, how would you do it? And this seemed to be the most common one. Was the idea of Venn diagram, which counterposed 3 circles. So people felt on the left-hand column that they were owners and staff. So owners and staff had a particular view of things, and then they were professionals. They were all professionals, or even if they weren't a clinical or a care professional, they were still a manager or administrator or a lawyer. They had professional backgrounds. This is highly professionalized organizations, so they had a professional quality perspective on things. And then also many of them had organizational or managerial hats on. So this idea of trying to think of sortition as a way of trying to get in between these 3 different identities here, because in these organizations that were employee owned, they are consciously trying to reduce the influence of managerial and hierarchical decision making. They're trying to get to a point where more people involved in more decisions, and that is not only a good thing in terms of making a better decision, but it's a good thing in itself. It improves people's well-being and their commitment, blah blah blah, the quality of decision making, etc. So they're trying to find ways of doing it, and the way that they approach sortition was to try to think about it as a conscious Venn diagram here, trying to reduce that sort of influence of managerialism. And the thing that I would try to get you to think about is in these highly professionalized organizations, sortition needs to think really clearly about how it aligns itself with professionalized, the professional way of looking at organizations as decision making, because if it must do that to gain, traction in those organizations and to sort of marry its view of making decisions in opposition to a standard sort of hierarchical managerial way of doing things. Staff ownership and staff being involved in sortition processes, they've got to think about it as a way of of improving the quality of care that they're providing and improving the professional input into decision making, because if they do, they're going to be a lot more positive in terms of their engagement. So before I sort of get into any more discussion points, I want to open it up for questions, really, because I'm conscious that people might have their own reflections on their own experiences as well, or might want some questions of sort of clarity.
So if no one else has one, I have a question. So you talked a lot to the people who were directly involved in these groups. How are the decisions and the processes perceived by people who didn't participate?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's a couple of things to say. One is that the executive board is made up of staff representatives as well. So although the sortition recommendations were modified to some extent, they were broadly speaking implemented. There was a bit of an iterative process where these groups were asked to refine things, and then they made second recommendations. But the executive board, which includes staff representatives, did engage and valued the sortition group. So, to some extent, they didn't ignore them, and also they've recommended that they use them on a sort of yearly basis. So, broadly speaking, they were supportive, and they've gone on. The other thing to say, I think, is that one of the problems, and I do mention it a little bit later on in the discussion points, but is that you do have to think really clearly about the people that the participants go back to talk to. So they are going back to people, and they've got to be trained and developed to be able to understand how you gather and engage other people in the process. So you don't have participants in the sortition group that are isolated, that you don't want them to feel that they're isolated, and you don't want other people to think that they're different. Yeah, they're there because they've been randomly selected. So they're not there because they're special. They're not there because they're a leader. They're there because they are a citizen in that organization. But at the same time, you've got to give them some training and development so they feel confident enough to re-engage and to go back to the organizations, go back to their old job, and be engaged and be accepted, and allow and maybe persuade other people to be part of the next sortation. So this idea of making sure that the stakeholders around them feel confident with them, and they're not isolated, they're not turned into new leaders, they're not new representatives, is really important. That interaction with their other, their peers is really important, and it's got to be thought through right at the beginning. How are they engaged in the people around them? Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you. We have questions from Rich and then from Chris.
Rich.
I'm really interested in the nuts and bolts of this and a real concrete term. First of all, you have a motivated group of people, self-owned businesses, but just to start this process, did they use some sort of template, or was it purely organically? Did it purely organically evolve? Hey, we want to make our managerial or our governance of the business more democratic. What are some ways? Can you give me?
Yeah. The first motivation was organic. I would describe it as organic. But the trade union reps were doing a little bit of homework. So they would talk to a colleague who would talk to a friend, and they ended up, thinking about how they might do it. So that level of methodology was there. So there was a process, but it was not theorized. It was a process that they used because they thought it would answer the questions they've got in front of them. There wasn't anything wider beyond that, other than they knew it was a good thing. I know that sounds, very simplistic, but they intuitively knew that it was a good thing. They had a methodology, but not a detailed theoretical process for it. So they had steps, and they knew they had to do some sort of random, and they knew they had to get them. They had to get them in a room. They had to get them time, and they had to give them information. Okay, and they had to be, and the executive board had to agree to it. It was not organic in the sense that they did it on their own. That, you know, I wouldn't say that at all. But the initial motivation and the first initial steps were organic, and then it became an organizational sort of process, and it was sold. And now it's more of a thing that makes them unique, which is really interesting. It's turned into a sort of organizational identity. You know, this is how we do things now. You know, we don't make these decisions in a older way. You know, 3, 4, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had this group, but now this is how we do these really difficult things. We try and get more staff engaged. So it's become, I think, you know, a much more important bit of their work, but I would not overestimate the theoretical input into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chris, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Aaron. I've run, I think, about 60 lotteries over the years, mostly for public policy,
Yeah.
I would say regular citizens and such. And typically, what you do is you match representation against clear and known data, such as censuses and all that sort of thing. You know, that information isn't always available within businesses, big, small, or like corporate sized. And I'm curious how you guys, or how the criteria for representation were settled in a kind of in a transparent way. Yeah,
that's a really good point. It's, you know, when I said that the organizations were quite sort of medium to large type, you know, they're not small organizations, they're not micro organizations. 700 to 1,000 people is quite big. But compared to some of the sampling that you would be doing, Chris, it's small, isn't it? You know, we're not talking about, you know, gaining, you know, a national or a state level or regional level sort of sortition group. You know, it's quite a small sample group. The first time they did it, it was quite crude. And what I mean by that is they knew that they needed the most important sampling criteria was a balance between the professional groups. Okay, it was not age, and it wasn't even gender, because these organizations are predominantly female, you know, employed organizations. They're not, you know, as we know, care and health community services are predominantly female employed. So they didn't have to worry too much about that, and they didn't worry too much about age. The first thing they did was that we need to sample. The first line of sampling was to get professional groups. You know, to get a, you know, how many nurses do we need out of 15? If we're going to have a 15 group, how many nurses approximately do we need? So that was the first thing. And then when they worked that out, then they worked out 2 criteria, and it was only 2 crude criteria. Once again, was age, you know, and that was very crude in terms, it wasn't by small bandings, Chris. It wasn't, you know, 20 to 30. It was 30 and below, 30 and above. So it was just 2 bandings for age. And then the other criteria that they used was a balance between departmental groups. So, you know, you get a balance of professionals, a balance of age, and a balance of departmental groups. So you didn't want, obviously, one departmental group to dominate. But they weren't significant problems in terms of there's not that many staff. So you couldn't break it down much further, Chris, because you're starting to, you lose the anonymization, and you lose the randomness, because you know, you start to break down. You know, some people, you know, they had to be owners as well. Remember, these were owners. Owners was a key part of the criteria of being part of that group. So 30% of staff weren't actually engaged in that first initial sortation process. So I'm sorry if I haven't got a sophisticated sampling process for you, but it's a bit crude to begin with.
I'm looking more for experience, less mechanisms.
Yeah.
If I can, and I'll put this into your head, I'm just, even if it's your thoughts, the difference between age and how long someone has been within an organization is different than if we're interacting with like policy issues, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have to answer now, but I would love to hear your thoughts, even if you didn't experiment or see it.
Yeah, they didn't sample on age. So they did sample on age. They didn't sample on your tenure in the organization. Okay. You're absolutely right. That came up in the other part of my research. So in the interview, some of these issues did come up because, yeah, they're looking at new ways to do things. And if you are steeped in a particular way of making decisions, it is quite hard to get out of it. So what I'm trying to suggest is you can look at an example of case studies, and you can look at the first round of sortitions that they did here, and then come to think that you're coming to conclusions, but you're not. You have to redo these and re-investigate and see how they develop over time, because learning how to make decisions without managers and coordinate services without managers is actually a difficult thing. If you have not been involved in it before, and the whole of your occupational life has been in a professional or managerial hierarchy, it's not just managers. Let's be fair. Professional hierarchies can work like that as well. Medical hierarchies and things like that. So these aren't easy things to do. So my next task is I'll be going back to formally research these organizations to see what has happened. I know they're carrying on, but I don't know whether it's working better, what lessons they've learned. And I think it's really important that we go back and do that. So this long-term thing is long-term in terms of the development of staff. You've got to train them and develop them to get the confidence to keep doing this, but also you've got to have research that helps them reflect. I think that's where the value of research is coming in, to try and introduce a little bit of theory and a little bit of reflection just to quicken their process of development. It's not much more than that. I can't answer the questions because there's not a lot of work in this area. I can help them reflect, though. I'm going to help them give them some feedback and some theorized thoughts. Hopefully that will help. But I think your question about how long you've been in the organization is a really good one. The longer you were, the more difficult you found this. That would be my very crude answer to that question. Not always, but we had managers that left because they couldn't work in this organization anymore. We had a really high turnover of managers, 10, 15, 20% in that 2-year period, because they just didn't know what to do. They had staff telling them, giving them feedback when they hadn't really experienced that before. And staff would say, well, I can do that because I'm an owner. There's something about ownership that has changed some of the dynamics there. The other thing I wanted to just highlight, there's loads of things about discussion here, but I do emphasize ownership because that is the key. I think one of the key changes for delivering sortition in organizations, it helped people justify why doing it. It was really helpful to it. It gave people confidence. But you've got, if you're introducing sortition in organizations, you've got to think about knowledge and who has knowledge and who has power in these organizations. And if you do it in a professional organizations, professions have a different knowledge base to managers, and they have a different power structure to managers. When they look at the same issue and collect different types of data and think different things are important to managers. Okay. And what deliberative democratic sort of processes do is that it introduces a third logic, different type, what's important to deliberative processes here isn't professional knowledge. It isn't sort of scientific knowledge. It isn't managerial, market cost price knowledge. It's the knowledge that the people in that organization have come to a conclusion about something. They've come to a consensus. They've learned something, and they've either voted on it or discussed it, and they've come up with something, and that's what makes it valuable. High levels of commitment. Now that is a different knowledge base. That's different. That's democratic knowledge. That is not professional. That is not scientific knowledge. That's not, law. It's not law. Not knowledge based on knowledge of the law. It's not knowledge based on costs and prices and things like that. So you can think about this as a third way of looking, or a fourth way of looking at what is important in an organization, what is valuable knowledge, and how do we use it. And I think that's the thing that really struck me, was about, they were debating different types of useful knowledge as an organization. What was justifiable knowledge? What was true knowledge? What was things we had to challenge? And I think that, I really found that valuable for myself.
Great. Benny and then Debbie.
Yeah. Yeah, I mostly have an interest in commercial businesses and how to start up this sort of things, because I found out that there is a lot of legal barriers actually. Because in my view, you also need some sort of ownership for the employees, for the
Yeah.
staff. And I can tell you here in Denmark, where I'm based, you have to, if you have to make a foundation that has rules that the employees are able to make these sort of decisions based on sortition or whatever, they need to have at least 51% of the company. And this is a legal barrier. If you want to give them 20%, for instance, you cannot do it. It's impossible, actually.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. This is the incremental bit of it, Benny, is that the less, I mean, first of all, I found employee ownership as being a beneficial thing. It's a good beginning. It started some of these debates. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is when employee ownership is below 50% of the organization, these groups tend to be advisory rather than actual decision makers. They advise the staff representative and executive board. When they get very, very high up, it's 80% employee owned and 90% even, they become a bit more executive. They actually make formal decisions. But the decision making processes in these organizations tend to be two. They tend to be the annual general meeting of all the employee owned entities, of all the employee owners, and the executive board that has staff representatives as well. So there's two bodies that normally make the decisions. The sortitions groups don't tend to make the final decision. They just recommend to those groups.
But that could also be fine. I'm just saying that the startup, because you will not find many businesses where they will give away 51% from day one.
You could try sortition in a non-employee owned organization as an advisory group and as an experiment and an example to see what it comes out with. But that is different from, I think, what I'm talking about here. This is an employee owned organization that wanted to introduce more engagement of staff, and this was one of its key mechanisms. You're right, Benny. You can't start, it's incremental steps. That was what I mean by untheorized practice here. This wasn't jumping to a highly developed sortition process in the first step. Sorry, I haven't got. There's not an easy answer to that one.
No, I guess so, but it's a good discussion at least.
Debbie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm a little bit surprised or maybe confused because my background is deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies, and when we talk about sortition, it's the process of randomly selecting the people, and then of course the participants aren't a sortition group. They, or at least we refer to them as, participants of whatever, of the assembly or. So yeah, that was kind of a new one for me. But I just want to say also, so I joined this call because anything to do with sortition is interesting. But to be honest, I work for an organisation that actually implemented the teal method, and it sounds very much very similar to what you're describing, though we also highlight responsibility because we are a much smaller organisation, and I don't know, it's all very, very new. It's people refer to it as the vision of the future organisations, and we all think it's wonderful, but we are employees in a non-profit. But we all have ownership of responsibility of our projects, and even raising funds and everything we do together. And whoever doesn't want to be involved in the decision making doesn't have to. But but then you can ask to be involved. It's not you don't have to be selected to be part of a forum or a decision making group. But so that's just one thing that I wanted to say. I just found that very interesting. And the other thing I wanted to ask was, in these two case studies that you did, were people actually compensated for being part of the? I mean, it sounds like it was it was a long process and it took up a lot of their time, and they even described it as hard. So were they compensated in extra time, money, I don't know, in any other way?
Yeah, don't worry. I'll try and answer your question quickly. But obviously, generally, people want to ask any sort of more detailed questions, or would like further discussion. I'm happy to do that. So, the first question is, sortition is just used because it was the word that they used. But you're right. I'm an organisational theorist rather than a deliberative democracy theorist. So that's fine. I do understand what you mean. It's just the word that they use, and they help them understand it. In terms of pay. No, the quick answer to that is no. But this is the point that I would make, is that they don't get any incentives for doing it, because it's their duty as a citizen of that organisation to do it. Okay, and when they got chosen, I think only one person was allowed out. Everybody was basically chosen, and you were chosen. You were in it. You were in that project group. Only one person was allowed, had special dispensation not to be there. So. Classic, a legal jury in that way. But the important thing is, you can't pay people to do it because it's part of their ordinary job, but you must backfill them. So if a nurse, nurse was allocated, let's say 20 days over 3 months, those 20 days had to be backfilled. So they would have to get another nurse from another department, or, bring in someone from for a short-term contract to fill in those sessions of that nurse. Without that, the process would break down. That's the pay bit. It's actually mega important.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Okay.
All right, so it is 7 o'clock. If no one has any objections, we can go on for a little longer. Aaron, if you have more points to cover.
Well, no, I've got a couple of points. I think I've sort of ended up talking it. So thanks very much for the questions. They're obviously they're really relevant to my discussion. I don't think I've said anything. I'm going to say anything different or separate from what you're asking. I think the last point, number 5, is really important that I found, which was that one of the things for looking at managers is that this is quite a hard sell to managers, because you are dealing with their power structure. Okay, so they're the ones who make decisions. When you move to an employee-owned organization, you are flipping the hierarchy, because managers are now accountable to the owners. So now staff, as owners, are now theoretically the bosses of the managers. That's how employee-owned just turns things upside down. Okay, now one way to look through this is that you've got to sort of sell it as a process for creativity and innovation, rather than another long, boring, democratic decision-making process that's going to slow everything down. That managers actually don't want passive recipients. They don't want passive people in their organization. They want more assertive and argumentative people, because they're the people that are going to come up with more interesting things for this organization to do, and to think creatively and come up with innovation. So you're trying to get them to think differently about the role of this deliberative process, that it's not slowing down decision making, it's reflective decision making, to make sure that we make the right decision. Then it's the most creative way of coming up with things. That can be quite difficult. This isn't easy to persuade managers to get engaged in, but that is probably the only way that you're going to think about it. And the last thing I'd leave you with is one trick for doing this is not to sell deliberative democracy in organizations, is to outline the costs of hierarchical decision making in organizations that currently exist. So you say the costs of making hierarchical decisions in organizations at the moment is really high, because basically managers make decisions too quickly. They make it with limited knowledge. They don't engage staff, and because they don't engage staff don't want to implement it. So they spend all their time implementing a decision that the staff are not signed up to. Now, if we can cost that would make deliberative democracy in organizations seem cheap. At the moment, it's sold as a costly, long-term process that's going to slow things down. And what we have to do is turn that upside down and say, well, actually, compared to how badly we make decisions in organizations at the moment and the cost of those bad decisions, right? Deliberative processes are actually cheap. They engage staff. You will get to a better decision, and you will get the right decision, and you'll be able to implement it easier because more people are signed up to it. I think that's a better way of selling this issue internally with organizations than the sort of democratic theorized language. I'm not sure it's going to work too much. I think you can make a business case for it in a bit more creative way. That's not because I don't believe in the democratic bits of it. I just don't think it works in an organization. I think the language and the rhetoric has to be, a bit different. That's all. That would be my experience of this process that I went through.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, Dr. Gang. Thanks for everybody who's come and who's asked questions. This has been really fascinating, really interesting, and quite heartening, I think.
I hope so. Yes.
To see how this stuff is becoming entrenched.
Yeah.
So thanks very much again, and great to see everybody here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Aaron.
To keep engaged if people want to. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Right. Oh, to have a couple of people. We appear to have a couple of people who have just joined. We have just finished the talk. I'm afraid you're an hour late. So apologies to Anne and to Kristen. This talk will be up online. So yes, thank you for your interest. I'm sorry that you arrived late. All right. Well, everybody, have a good evening.
Wait just a second so I can copy the.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to copy the chat so that I can disseminate the information. Okay, I've got it. Thanks.
Great. Does anyone have anything else? Any other points? Just before we go, anything? Anybody need any information or anything like that? All right. Well, I'll see you all later.